there was blood at the front door. The security cameras had been smashed, and a masked, armed figure captured in the moments before those cameras went dark had come to this house in the middle of the night with a backpack and a plan. That is what the first hours of this investigation looked like from the outside. What the FBI did next is what this investigation actually is. They contacted foreign law enforcement in another country. They recovered footage from cameras that had been physically destroyed, working directly with a private technology company to do it. That is not normal. That is escalation. They built a suspect list, and they started knocking on doors. They executed federal search warrants at 2 separate locations, carried out by SWAT teams. They activated investigative genetic genealogy, the same method that identified the suspect in the Idaho student murders. Not over months, almost simultaneously. The investigators working the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie know considerably more than they have disclosed. The gap between what has been said publicly and what has been done operationally is not an accident. It is a strategy. Start with the first decision, what the FBI did in the first day, because that decision reveals what investigators already know. And by the end of this episode, you will see the same pattern they are following and why this case is closer to resolution than it appears. In the early hours of February 1st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in the foothills area northeast of Tucson, Arizona. She was 84 years old, the mother of NBC Today show anchor Savannah Guthrie. She was not confused. She had not wandered. Blood marked the entry point. The Nest security cameras, plural, had been smashed or physically taken. And in the moments before those cameras went dark, a figure had been captured on one of them, masked, armed, carrying a backpack, approaching the front of the home at an hour when no visitor was expected. Nancy Guthrie was gone. The FBI arrived the following morning, not days later, the morning after she was reported missing. That speed is not standard for a missing persons case. It reflects a classification decision made at the federal level within hours of the first report. This was not treated as a disappearance. It was treated as a crime. That determination made almost immediately is the foundation of everything that follows. The FBI's speed was significant for another reason. It arrived to a scene that had already been mishandled. The Pima County Sheriff's Department reached the home first. And in those initial critical hours, the hours that cannot be recovered, the scene was treated as a search and rescue operation, not a crime scene. Search and rescue accepts that evidence will be disturbed in service of finding a living person. Crime scene protocol locks everything down before a single item is touched. Once you process a location as one, you cannot reprocess it as the other. Blood was already at the threshold. A masked, armed figure had approached the home at night. Every indicator pointed to crime, not to a confused person who wandered away. 34-year law enforcement veteran Randy Sutton was direct. This should have been taped off from the first officer's arrival. The blood at the door alone was sufficient. There was no ambiguity. The scene was processed incorrectly. Time passed within that incorrect framework. Every hour lost at the beginning is distance gained by the person who planned this. It established a pattern that would define the first weeks of this investigation, the local agency making determinations the evidence did not support, and the federal agency arriving behind it to work around those decisions. To understand why the FBI operated largely outside the local sheriff's awareness, you need to understand what it found when it arrived. Before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the Pima County Sheriff's Department was already in crisis. Sheriff Chris Nanos had received a no confidence vote from his own department. Not a narrow vote, not a contentious result. Nearly unanimous? That level of internal repudiation does not happen over personality conflicts. It reflects a department's assessment that its leadership has damaged its ability to function. In this case, the specific damage was directly relevant. Nanos had engaged in an internal dispute with the detectives assigned to his homicide bureau. His response was to reassign the experienced investigators to patrol as punishment and replace them with personnel who lacked equivalent experience. By some accounts, one of the detectives placed in that unit had never investigated a homicide. Removing the people who had that experience deliberately, punitively left the Bureau, structurally compromised at the precise moment a federal-level kidnapping landed in its jurisdiction. The FBI recognized this immediately. But even within that joint operation, the divide between the two agencies became publicly visible in a specific way. When journalists confirmed that federal agents had been physically visiting gun stores across Tucson with photographs of named suspects confirmed by store employees on camera, Nanos told reporters that did not happen. It did happen. Those discrepancies are not miscommunications. They reveal that the FBI was conducting significant investigative work entirely outside the sheriff's awareness and had made a deliberate choice to keep it that way. When an agency operating at the FBI's level stops informing its nominal partner of what it is doing, that is a judgment about that partner's operational security. Before we go further, hold the full picture. This investigation has deployed forensic video reconstruction to recover footage from physically destroyed cameras. It has run biological evidence through the National Criminal DNA Database. When that produced no match, it escalated to investigative genetic genealogy. It has issued federal search warrants executed by SWAT teams at 2 separate locations. It has sent agents to gun retailers across the county with photographs of named suspects. It has coordinated with law enforcement in Mexico. It has used polygraph examinations as an internal investigative filter. It has tracked a digital reconnaissance trail originating in Tucson that spans months before the abduction. And it has done most of this while managing a functional divide between a federal agency and a local sheriff who, by multiple accounts, was not fully informed of what the federal side was doing. This is not a stalled investigation. The absence of a public arrest at this level of resource and activity is itself a data point. The evidence is not thin. What is missing is the convergence, the moment when the separate threads reach the same person. This episode examines those threads. Every serious abduction investigation begins with the same investigative logic. You start closest, not because the people closest to a victim are likely perpetrators, because proximity creates access. Access creates possibility. And eliminating possibility closest to home is what allows investigators to expand outward with confidence. The Pima County Sheriff's Department applied this framework immediately. In a BBC interview, Nanos acknowledged publicly what the early phase of the investigation actually looked like. Investigators had, as he put it, put the family through the ringer. Vehicles were taken. Phones were seized, homes were searched, all voluntarily, all cooperated with in full. He clarified they are victims, they are not suspects. But his account of the early investigation, taken alongside reporting from credible law enforcement sources in the first week, tells a more specific story. Multiple journalists with confirmed law enforcement sources reported that in the early days, the Sheriff's Department had effectively concentrated its focus on a specific individual within the family's immediate inner circle. Not publicly named, not charged, but treated for a period as the central investigative focus. If accurate, that explains the operational pattern in the early phase of this investigation. It explains the speed at which phones and vehicles were seized. It explains the limited initial canvas of the external neighborhood for outside perpetrators. It explains the delayed engagement with certain categories of external evidence categories that later proved significant. Then the FBI recovered the video. The figure on that camera, masked, armed, purposeful, was not someone any member of the family appeared to know. The family was cleared. And the question that hangs over the early weeks of this investigation, whether the initial focus cost time that a perpetrator used to create distance, is one that investigators are not publicly answering. But the timeline is visible, and the timeline matters. This is where the investigation formally changed direction. When local law enforcement examined the front porch area, the conclusion was straightforward. The Nest cameras had been physically attacked and rendered useless. The sheriff stated publicly that no camera footage was available. The FBI did not accept that assessment. That is a significant distinction. The FBI's response was not to confirm the local finding and move on. It was to reject the conclusion and start again. Working directly with Google, which operates the Nest camera cloud infrastructure, FBI technical teams applied what has since been described publicly as a video scratching process. The analogy offered was an onion. Each layer of damaged or corrupted data is peeled away carefully to reach what lies beneath. What lay beneath was recoverable. The front porch footage existed. On that footage, a figure approaches the home in the darkness of early morning, masked, armed, a backpack on his back. He takes his time at the front of the home before entry. He is not in a rush. That footage became the primary visual evidence in this case. The FBI released photographs from it publicly. Investigators began distributing it to tip lines, to facial recognition systems, to a public that was now looking for a face. But the recovery of that footage did something else. It established, on the record, that the sheriff's public statement that no footage was available was wrong. The cameras had not failed. The footage had not been lost. A federal team working with a private technology company had found what local investigators had concluded did not exist. The sheriff did not issue a public correction. He moved forward. But the public record now contained a documented gap between what local leadership had stated and what the federal agency had established. There are additional cameras. The sheriff confirmed to multiple reporters that other cameras existed inside and outside the home. Those cameras were turned over to Google and the FBI for the same forensic extraction process. As of the time this analysis was produced, those cameras have not yielded publicly confirmed footage. The FBI is still working them. That fact alone, that federal technical resources are still engaged on this, tells you the investigation has not exhausted what the physical evidence may still hold. The front porch video was reviewed by law enforcement veterans, former FBI investigators, and behavioral analysts, most of whom have spoken publicly about what they observed. Their conclusions converge on several points. First, this was targeted. This was not a burglary. Nighttime intrusion into an occupied home, what law enforcement categorizes as hot prowl, is exceptionally rare in Pima County. The statistical record shows it essentially does not happen there. Burglars avoid occupied residences by design. The risk calculus of confronting an occupant makes the crime type structurally incompatible with this scenario. This perpetrator came to an occupied home at night with a weapon, carrying a backpack, wearing gloves. That is not burglary. That is abduction. Second, this was premeditated. The outfit tells you that. The mask, the specific clothing, the gloves, the holster, the backpack. These items do not appear by accident on a person approaching a private residence at night. They are assembled with purpose. This person prepared. Third, and this is where the analysis becomes more specific, his behavior at the scene contains a detail that multiple analysts have flagged. He was not in a hurry. He spent time at the front of the home. He did not rush entry. He did not appear to be reacting to unexpected circumstances or fighting a timeline imposed by fear of detection. The behavioral interpretation offered by former law enforcement, the perpetrator may have believed that the occupant was already incapacitated before he approached the front door. If that interpretation is accurate, it changes the profile of this crime fundamentally. It implies that something happened to Nancy Guthrie before the figure on the front porch camera arrived. An entry from the rear, a collaborator, a method of incapacitation applied in advance. The back door of the home was found open after her disappearance. Nancy's blood was found at the front door. Rear door open. Blood at the front entrance. Those two physical facts, in combination, suggest that the movement through this home and out of it involved more than one person and more than one point of entry. At least one former law enforcement analyst believes a minimum of 3 individuals were involved. Someone entering from the rear, the figure at the front, and a driver staged outside. If that reconstruction is accurate, this was an operation. It required planning, coordination, timing, and communication that did not involve the cell phone network, because no cell phone data from this location at this hour has been publicly confirmed. Experienced operatives planning a high-risk abduction know to leave phones behind. The absence of cell signal data is consistent with that level of operational awareness, which makes the digital trail investigators found originating months earlier all the more significant. Law enforcement investigators confirmed a series of Google searches originating from the Tucson area, spanning the months before the abduction. Read them in order. The sequence is the story. Months before the abduction, well in advance, someone in Tucson searched for Nancy Guthrie's home address. Later, that search was repeated. The same address, a second look. Then, the searches shifted. Whoever was searching stopped looking for the address and started looking for images of the property. Not just where it was, what it looked like, the layout, the approaches. In the weeks before the abduction, a search was conducted from Tucson for Savannah Guthrie's salary. Not Nancy, her daughter, the anchor, the public figure whose name and income were searchable. Then, within weeks of the night of February 1st, the address was searched again. And then again in the days approaching the abduction itself. Address, images of the property, financial research on the family, address, again, final confirmation. Behavioral analysts and former law enforcement who reviewed this pattern applied a framework they call the attack planning cycle. It describes exactly this: initial subject selection, location intelligence gathering, revisitation to confirm no changes, financial assessment of the target, final confirmation immediately before action. This search pattern does not resemble curiosity about a public figure. It resembles operational reconnaissance. The searches escalated in specificity over time. They were spaced deliberately. They converged on the night of the abduction with the discipline of someone moving through a checklist. Someone was doing homework, methodically, over months. The FBI is now working to determine whether these searches trace back to a single IP address. If they do, that IP links the entire planning timeline to a specific account holder in Tucson. Google can be compelled to produce that attribution. The legal mechanism, a search warrant or subpoena, is entirely standard. The FBI has the authority and the precedent. The question is not whether they can trace this. The question is what they find when they do. The DNA in this investigation tells a story in two parts. The first part ends without an answer. The second part is still in progress, and it is the part investigators believe may break this case. Biological evidence was recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. What form that evidence takes, blood, touch, DNA, another biological material, has not been publicly specified. That information is being withheld deliberately. It is what investigators call holdback evidence, known only to law enforcement and presumably whoever left it behind. That evidence was run through the National Criminal DNA Database, CODIS, the database that holds the profiles of individuals convicted of qualifying criminal offenses in the United States. There was no match. That result means one specific thing. The person whose DNA was recovered inside Nancy Guthrie's home had not previously been convicted of a qualifying offense in this country. It is not a dead end. It is a fork. The investigation escalated to the next tier: investigative genetic genealogy. This is the method that identified Brian Kohberger as the suspect in the University of Idaho student murders. That case was considered effectively stalled. Then, IGG produced a familial connection. Investigators traced it inward. They had a name. IGG does not require the perpetrator's own DNA profile to exist anywhere. It requires a relative, a cousin, an aunt, a grandparent to have voluntarily contributed their DNA to a consumer ancestry platform. The databases built by services like Ancestry DNA and GEDmatch are enormous and growing. The unknown DNA from the crime scene is profiled and compared against those databases. A partial familial match, even a distant one, creates a starting point. From that point, genealogical research traces outward: marriages, children, locations, generations. The tree is then progressively narrowed by geography. If the genealogical trace points to family roots connected to Tucson, Arizona, and if the digital reconnaissance trail already places the planner in Tucson, that is a convergence. two independent investigative threads pointing to the same place. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has publicly confirmed that IgG is actively being applied to the DNA evidence recovered from inside the home. The investigation is waiting on those results. That wait is not passive. It is the most active investigative process currently in motion in this case. Federal agents visited gun stores across the Tucson area. They brought photographs and names, a suspect list built from the evidence, and they showed it to store employees and owners. Do you recognize any of these people? Have any of them made purchases you can trace? Check your records. This was not a general inquiry. This was targeted canvassing based on a constructed list. That list did not appear from nothing. To build it, investigators applied filters derived from the front porch footage. Approximate physical build, specific clothing items, the backpack, the holster style, the footwear. Each of those elements is a purchasable item. Purchasable items leave transaction records. Transaction records, cross-referenced by geography and time frame, begin to converge on names. Those names became the list. The canvas was designed to test whether any name on that list had also purchased a firearm, confirming a behavioral profile consistent with the planning of an armed abduction. When Sheriff Nanos was asked about this canvassing operation by a reporter, he said it had not happened. It had happened. Gun store employees confirmed it on camera. The pattern was now established beyond the first incident. The FBI was conducting significant investigative operations with resources, targets, and outcomes that the nominal head of the joint investigation was not aware of. This was not a communication gap. This was the federal agency making a judgment about what information the local command could be trusted to hold. 2 SWAT operations have been publicly connected to this investigation. The first occurred in Rio Rico, a community roughly an hour south of Tucson, notably in the direction of the Mexican border. A man named Carlos Pelos was detained for hours and eventually released. His phone and identification were seized. He has not been charged. His attorney maintained he has no connection to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The second took place within a short distance of Nancy Guthrie's home. A federal search warrant was executed. A man named Luke Daly and his mother were detained. Items were seized. No arrest was made. His attorney confirmed he has no ties to the Guthrie family and is cooperating. The public interpretation of both operations was wrong turns, dead ends, failures. That interpretation misunderstands how federal search warrants work. A warrant can be for arrest, or it can be for evidence. Arrest requires probable cause. A person committed the crime. Evidence requires probable cause. The location holds proof. Different standards, different outcomes. No arrest at the scene does not mean the operation failed. It means phones, computers, and documents are now in a forensic laboratory. That analysis takes time. Its findings may connect weeks later to something else entirely. The second operation involved a federal warrant reviewed and signed by a federal judge. Federal judges do not sign warrants based on speculation, especially not in cases of this profile. Something specific brought investigators to that address. A federal judge signed off for a reason. That reason is one of the live threads. For the first several weeks of this investigation, the Pima County Sheriff maintained a consistent public position on the question of Mexico. No evidence that Nancy Guthrie had been taken south, no communication with Mexican authorities. That avenue was not being pursued. In an early press conference, days after the abduction, Nanos was asked directly whether his department had been in contact with Mexican law enforcement officials. His answer was no. 3 separate national news organizations, News Nation, Fox News, and TMZ, each independently confirmed through federal law enforcement sources that the FBI had been in contact with Mexican authorities in connection with this case. All 3 received that confirmation around the same time. The sheriff said no. The FBI's actions said otherwise. The geography explains why Mexico cannot be excluded. Nancy Guthrie's home sits roughly 75 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border. A single interstate, an hour to an hour and a half by car. A former FBI special agent who spent years at the Tucson field office working the Southwest Border Violence portfolio was direct about the operational logic. If you are transporting an abducted person out of Tucson, the southern route is the most viable. Moving in any other direction means passing through more domestic checkpoints and creating more exposure. Moving south means reaching the border before a missing persons report has been filed. The crossing itself is asymmetric. Entry from the United States into Mexico does not carry the same level of scrutiny as entry from Mexico into the United States. Checkpoints are primarily oriented inbound. A vehicle crossing south is, relative to other escape options, the path of least investigative resistance. If the perpetrators went south, they were across the border before any search was underway. The FBI maintains a permanent legal attaché presence in Mexico, specifically for this kind of cross-border criminal activity. That channel almost certainly was activated early. Operational security kept it quiet. What is now confirmed publicly, the FBI-Mexico communication exists. What remains unconfirmed, whether investigators have evidence placing Nancy Guthrie on the southern side of that border, or whether the Mexico engagement is precautionary, covering a geographic possibility that the available evidence cannot rule out. The sheriff told the BBC he believes Nancy is somewhere, locally, in the community. When asked why, he said he just does, no evidence, a feeling. The FBI is covering both possibilities. One of those is an investigative position. Polygraph examinations are not admissible in court. That is not why investigators use them. They serve a directional function, not to produce evidence, but to allocate investigative attention. A result consistent with truthfulness lets investigators move on. A result inconsistent with it keeps that person in the frame. Multiple journalists confirmed through law enforcement sources that polygraph examinations had been conducted in the Nancy Guthrie investigation as part of the process of clearing individuals connected to the case. The examinations were conducted earlier in the investigation, in the weeks following the disappearance, as part of the systematic process of narrowing the investigative field. The obvious implication: specific individuals within the orbit of this case were subjected to polygraph testing. Who they were has not been confirmed publicly. But given where the investigation's early focus was concentrated on the inner circle, on those with knowledge of and access to the home, the polygraphs were almost certainly applied in that direction. The family was cleared. Each cleared individual moved investigators closer to the person who has not been cleared. It doesn't prove guilt. It tells investigators where the truth is not. The evidence does not yet identify who took Nancy Guthrie, but it does narrow what kind of person they are, and it points toward why. Motive is not a peripheral concern in this kind of investigation. It is structural. Identify the motive clearly enough, and the suspect category shrinks to a manageable size. Law enforcement veterans and behavioral analysts who have reviewed this case have been consistent on one point: the burglary theory does not survive scrutiny. Hot prowl residential burglary, nighttime intrusion into an occupied home, is a category of crime that almost never occurs in Pima County. Burglars avoid occupied residences. That avoidance is the operational logic of the crime type. An intruder who enters a home knowing someone is there has fundamentally changed the nature of what they are doing. Add the weapon, the mask, the backpack, the gloves, the premeditation visible in every element of the figure's appearance. This was not an opportunistic intrusion. This was a targeted abduction. And targeted abductions have a specific motive architecture. 3 possibilities have been actively explored by investigators: financial motivation, ransom, or access to the Guthrie family's resources; personal grievance, revenge against Nancy Guthrie or someone connected to her; and coercive leverage, using Nancy's safety to compel action by another person. The ransom picture has become progressively clearer and progressively less credible as the primary motive. Multiple communications claiming to be ransom demands have been received in connection with this case. Each varied in format, in the specific cryptocurrency requested, in the stated consequences. The FBI addressed the volume of these communications publicly, warning that anyone attempting to exploit this family through fraudulent demands would face federal charges. An individual connected to one of those fraudulent communications was arrested. Real ransom operations do not work the way these communications have worked. Real ransom requires proof of life. It requires demonstrating that the person is alive and that the demand is attached to something real. Without proof of life, no one with access to significant resources and legal counsel is going to respond to a demand. That is not how it works. No credible proof of life has emerged. The absence of that proof in a case where the financial profile of the family is publicly known and substantial fundamentally shifts the motive analysis. If money was the goal, the operation failed at the execution stage. Or money was never the goal. What remains is personal. Someone took Nancy Guthrie because of a relationship. Not necessarily their relationship to Nancy herself, but a relationship to someone in her orbit. The pre-crime research into Savannah Guthrie's professional profile suggests the planner was thinking about the family as a whole. The significance attached to a specific family member, the reach of the Guthrie name. Multiple law enforcement analysts have said this explicitly. When this case resolves, the identified perpetrator will have a connection to someone in the Guthrie household's extended world. It may be tenuous, it may be indirect, but it will be there. That connection is what investigators are working to find. And the digital trail that began months before the abduction, the methodical, escalating reconnaissance, is the place most likely to expose it. Here is what is confirmed. Biological evidence recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home produced no match in the National Criminal Database. That result has escalated the forensic pathway to investigative genetic genealogy, an active, ongoing process that requires time but has a documented record of success in cases far colder than this one. The digital reconnaissance trail months of Tucson-based searches for Nancy Guthrie's home address, her property images, and her daughter's professional profile has been confirmed by law enforcement sources. Those searches are currently being traced through IP attribution. If a single account holder can be linked to the full pattern, investigators will have a name connected to the planning process. The suspects photographed and canvassed through gun retailers across the county represent a deliberately constructed pool built from the physical evidence visible in the front porch footage. That canvas has not produced a publicly confirmed match, but it has produced information. Information from that canvas is in analysis. The materials seized in both SWAT operations, phones, and other items are in forensic laboratory processing. Laboratory analysis produces results on its own timeline. Those results have not been publicly disclosed. They may not be for some time. The FBI's active engagement with Mexican law enforcement has established a cross-border intelligence channel that will remain open as long as Nancy Guthrie's location is unconfirmed. That channel covers both the possibility of southward transport and the possibility of perpetrators with cross-border connections. The front porch video footage has been released publicly. The figure in that footage has been seen by an enormous number of people. Federal facial recognition systems have processed it. Someone in this country, possibly in Tucson itself, knows who that person is. The combined reward offered for information leading to Nancy Guthrie's location and the identification of her abductor is substantial. The FBI contributed half. An anonymous private donor matched it. President Trump has addressed this case publicly and repeatedly. That level of political visibility does not accelerate forensic science, but it ensures that resource allocation at the federal level remains at the ceiling. Every investigative avenue that can be worked is being worked. An investigation operating at this level does not stall. It processes, it waits on science, it traces digital threads, it analyzes seized materials. It works the genealogy software against databases populated by people who never imagined their ancestry results would help identify a kidnapper. But it does not stop. The evidence in this case is not thin. The front porch video exists and has been publicly distributed. The biological evidence from inside the home exists and is in active forensic processing. The digital reconnaissance trail exists and is being traced to a source. The seized materials from the federal search warrants exist and are in laboratory analysis. The bilateral FBI-Mexico intelligence channel exists and is active. Every one of those threads is live. What is absent, and what defines this moment in the investigation, is convergence. The point at which separate evidence lines reach the same person. That moment has not arrived publicly. But former law enforcement veterans who understand the architecture of major federal investigations have estimated that the vast majority of what investigators know has not been disclosed. The public picture, significant as it is, represents a fraction of the operational intelligence in this case. That estimate should recalibrate how every public statement is read. When the sheriff says he believes Nancy is local, but cannot explain why that is not an investigative position. When the FBI maintains contact with Mexico while the sheriff denies it, that is not miscommunication. When SWAT executes a federal warrant and releases everyone without charge, that is not a failure. These are the visible edges of an investigation working below the surface. The architecture of this crime, the months of planning, the operational coordination, the deliberate targeting of one specific woman in one specific home produced evidence. It always does. The planners left a digital trail. They left biological material. They left a figure on a camera. They left physical evidence at the scene and along the route of departure. None of it has been found to point nowhere. All of it is in motion. The question is not whether investigators will identify who took Nancy Guthrie. The question is which thread resolves first and how close behind it the others follow.